EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. President Biden's Education Secretary, Miguel Cardona, is marking his first year in office. And what a year it has been, not just for the federal agency he oversees, but for schools, educators, students, and families. We're going to look back at Secretary Cardona's first year and ahead to his second with the help of two expert reporters. Andrew Ujifusa is an assistant editor at Education Week, where he writes about national education policy, and he also authors the Politics K-12 blog. Andrew, always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
And making his triumphant return to EWA Radio is Eric Kelderman. He's a longtime national policy reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Welcome back, Eric.
I thought we were just going to talk about Wordle today.
Would that it were so. That'll be for my Substack spinoff.
What's Wordle?
All right, gentlemen, we got a lot of ground to cover. So, Andrew, I want to start on the K-12 side. It's not an understatement to say the pandemic has been what we hope is a once-in-a-generation crisis for public education. There's been a lot of frustration among educators and families that there wasn't a clear federal directive immediately on what to do about schools. How much of Secretary Cardona's first year has really just been about crisis management?
I think a lot of it has been about crisis management. And I think that based on his actions and how he talks about schools in this moment, I think he kind of views himself as like the head of the National Education Help Desk, along with sort of being a mentor or a life coach for schools, if that analogy makes sense. So Miguel Cardona knows he can't be the boss of public schools. He can't tell them what to do on a day-to-day basis, right? That's not power the education department has. But what he tells school leaders and how he talks to the public about schools still matters, right? So, one person put it to me this way. The way he talks about schools can sort of be summed up as, you need to stay open and help students, and you're doing a great job. So that messaging, right, is kind of a combination of pressure and praise, like keep it up. Don't stop. Don't tire out. Keep going. You need to do this for everyone involved, right? He's provided specific guidance to schools, for example, about how to use federal funds for solving practical problems, right, like staff shortages. But he's also talked about the impact this has had on parents and students and how they can't be left behind. I think he also knows that a lot of the people making day-to-day decisions, individual districts and states, are the ones who ultimately have to lead, who have to make the tough calls, from district superintendents to union leaders, right? And he's not really in the business of calling those folks out. You've actually seen the president sort of grumble once or twice about schools not reopening for in-person learning, despite getting a lot of relief money. You haven't really seen Cardona do that. Some people might think he's leading from behind. That can be good or bad in your perspective, but I think he's taken sort of a multifaceted approach to this.
You wrote recently that Secretary Cardona came into office with a message for educators, and that message was, I am one of you. And certainly that is the antithesis of his predecessor, Betsy DeVos, who had never worked in a school, had no education administrative experience to speak of, and actually had suggested that we didn't even need a Department of Education. So clearly a very big departure from Secretary Cardona, who came with a wealth of experience primarily at the K-12 level from his home state of Connecticut. Has that message held up with educators?
I think if you talk to the big sort of alphabet soup groups, as they're called, that represent educators and have some influence in Washington, like the teachers' unions, but others too, I don't think you'll hear a lot of satisfaction. For a recent story you mentioned, we talked to AFT President Randi Weingarten. And she admitted that, Cardona and the Biden administration haven't moved as quickly as her union would like to address certain issues. You think about like the availability of COVID testing for schools, for example. But, in general, I think she praised his performance and said he's doing a good job in supporting her members and educators as best he can. I feel like those groups, especially people sort of at the top of the heap, feel like they have a peer who's going to listen to their needs and try and act on them. Frankly, a lot of teachers probably don't spend much, if any, time thinking about Cardona. I think we've gotten used to, in recent years before Cardona, education secretaries really being in the spotlight, like Arne Duncan and Betsy DeVos. But historically, the norm has been like education secretaries don't get a ton of attention or an outsized amount of attention. And Cardona may be closer to that sort of model in terms of his profile than like Betsy DeVos. And I do think there's a subset of teachers, especially ones on Twitter, one could say, who we've talked to, who said that Cardona has been talking too much about the need to reopen schools and not championing their interests enough, what needs to be done to keep them safe. And they think that he should talk more about the pressures they're facing and how they need more support to do their jobs. I don't think that's like a majority of teachers, but they're out there. And as long as we're in this pandemic, I think there are going to be teachers who are dissatisfied with where things are and by extension with Cardona's leadership.
So that's one big constituency. There's another one, of course, and that's parents. And Linda Jacobson, writing for the 74 in a long takeout looking at Secretary Cardona's first year, builds a case and an argument that parents have been left out of a lot of these conversations and in some cases literally did not have a seat at the table at some of these early roundtables as they tried to figure things out. What's your take on that?
I've seen those too. I think that was a good story. And I think that Cardona and his team have clearly become attuned to that criticism or that concern. In a speech he gave just yesterday, actually, on January 27th, he put the issue in pretty stark terms. He said, if we're not closing educational gaps, we're making them worse. And I think that was a way to try and connect with parents. And I think in general, the way he tries to put parents' interest sort of to the fore, especially in light of the pandemic and what's happened. He wants kids more connected to schools and schools more connected to students. So that's kind of the two-way street that he wants to see. And especially the latter part about schools needing to do more to connect with their students. That's speaking to parents, right? Here's how schools should be serving your child and your community. I think that's his way of saying that despite his background as an educator and being attuned to their needs, he wants to see the educational system not just sort of return to pre-pandemic normal. Nobody really says they want that per se, but that he wants schools making more efforts along those lines, more tutoring, students participating in more extracurricular activities. I think that's part of his message to signal to parents that he gets their concerns.
Betsy DeVos came in with a clear platform, and that was school choice. What has Cardona shown he's most passionate about on the K-12 side?
Again, just highlight the issue I just mentioned, closing educational gaps in terms of opportunities, in terms of achievement. I just mentioned that his talking point or his comment that if we're not closing those gaps, we're making them worse. That's not someone who's like warm and fuzzy about the issue, right? Or wants to be especially nuanced about it in his public rhetoric. I think he's very keen and very passionate about highlighting how different groups of students need different types of support and more support, whether it's more attention, more funding, and things like that. He likes to bring up his own personal story about not speaking English when he first started out in Connecticut public schools as a kid. I would also say he's made this clear in one or two combative hearings with lawmakers on Capitol Hill. I think he's also clear that he really trusts educators. In particular, he trusts educators to figure out how to address controversial topics in their classrooms. Topics like those that deal with race and what we teach students about our history, right, and what that means. Now, some of this has to do with politics, like as a Biden administration official, he wants to show that he supports educators in those high leverage, high profile moments that can go viral, right? But I also think it personally means a lot to him because he has been in their shoes as an educator, as a teacher, administrator, and so on. And he's made it clear he really doesn't like politicians trying to make out like educators are indoctrinating students instead of really educating them.
Eric Kelderman, Chronicle of Higher Education, I want to turn to you. As we mentioned, Secretary Cardona is a career educator, although most of his experience is at the K-12 level. Where has he had the steepest learning curve in terms of federal higher education policy?
I wouldn't describe Cardona's movements or policies on higher ed as needing a learning curve. He's got some pretty capable people that he's put in place, Undersecretary James Quall and Deputy Secretary Michelle Ash Cooper, longtime advocates for the kinds of things that you would expect from the Biden administration. But I think it's a matter of priority. Aside from the more obvious policy choices, K-12 has taken the spotlight really during the pandemic, I think in a way that was somewhat shouldn't have been unexpected, right? We'll always have more K-12 parents in the country. And I think that's a bit of a reversal. And so I think it's just, certainly the department is making moves in higher education policy, and we'll talk about those. But I think it's just a matter of focus at this point, which is we've got to get K-12 schools open because that really impacts all those parents, their ability to work and function in life if their kids are home and they're trying to do remote schooling while they're supposed to be online doing their jobs.
I think that makes a lot of sense. But in terms of priorities, I mean, certainly on President Biden's first day in office, when we were in the pandemic, he hit pause on federal student loan repayments. And in recent press conference, Secretary Cardona trumpeted that $15 billion had been forgiven for about 675,000 borrowers. Is there something that those data points is masking or not telling us about that?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is always the case with numbers, right? No, those numbers are big. And look, that's really great news for those 675,000 people who have had their debts erased, right? And that number is going to continue to grow. The department has made a really concerted effort to sort out the problems with the public service loan forgiveness. So there are millions of more people who are going to see zero balance on their loans in this year and the coming years. But in the context, those people are still just a tiny fraction of the overall number and amount of student debt, right? We have in May, they're supposed to start repayment. 40 million borrowers are going to start repayment on their student loans. That's been paused, and they hold more than $1.5 trillion of debt. That's an enormous administrative challenge. And given some of the back and forth that we've had between the department and the companies that are hired to service these loans. And so we won't know how it's going really for several months or maybe even a year after that May date. But there's potential for, I guess, big problems there in terms of restarting the repayments. I think most importantly, maybe, what's not in those numbers is those numbers are not going to make people like Senator Elizabeth Warren happy, because they've been demanding since the campaign, really, that the administration forgive individual debt up to $50,000 for individuals. And that's a real contrast with what the Biden administration has promised, which is up to $10,000, and Congress has to do it. The Senate, maybe for obvious reasons, because they're not getting any legislation through, once the administration deflects its executive authority, and the president has so far refused to do that.
It's almost like it's really complicated and not something that an education secretary can do unilaterally on their own, Eric.
Almost. It's exactly like that, in fact. That's a great point, Emily. Spoiler alert, running the federal government is really, really, really hard. These are big, complex issues. And I think people that expected quick, easy solutions to the pandemic problems, to the student loan problems when Biden took office, I don't know why they would be surprised that these are difficult.
President Biden also expressed his commitment to both community colleges, where First Lady Jill Biden is a professor, and also to HBCUs. Has Cardona's office had any policy to effect on those fronts that we should talk about?
The big areas there are money in the bully pulpit, right? The First Lady herself, a community college instructor, has brought a lot of attention to these institutions, and certainly HBCUs are having something of a very positive moment in the limelight. We have the vice president is a graduate of our own Howard University right here in Washington, D.C. So that's terrific press, as they say, right? And so I think those are the big things. Obviously, HBCUs and minority-serving institutions got a huge boost in money from the last coronavirus relief bill, and also in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. Some of that job training money will, of course, go to community colleges as well. So those are the no big, huge policy changes per se, but money and attention.
The U.S. Supreme Court is going to hear a case challenging race-conscious admissions at Harvard University, which could have a ripple effect, of course, for post-secondary institutions nationally. Let's say, as some have speculated, that the conservative majority on the court says no more affirmative action. How does that impact Cardona's office?
It's a really difficult question to answer because we haven't had to tackle this per se before, right? In law, there are prohibitions against discriminating against race. I'm going to speculate here just a little bit and say if the court were to overturn, and it would depend on how broad the ruling is, right? But if the court were somehow to overturn the use of race in any capacity in the admissions process, I guess it's possible that the Department of Ed and the Department of Justice in some ways would have to go through the rulemaking process, through some regulatory change to put it into the Higher Ed Act that these things were forbidden. Boy, that's like 3 steps away from anything that's happening for a long time. So, I mean, it's difficult, right? Because we're talking about, in some cases at least, private institutions who have not been compelled to disclose their admissions processes. So it raises a real nest of thorny issues. There have been some speculation that it's unenforceable. I think in the end, though, that colleges' legal counsel are going to, if the Supreme Court were to take this stand and it's a broad ruling, then general counsels across the country would be scrambling to change their admissions policies. I think no college really wants to get sued. Whether or not it can be enforced, I think colleges are likely going to try to comply with the law.
As everyone in this conversation knows, if you're on the education beat long enough, you see these transitions between presidential administrations and education secretaries. And one of the things that always happens is you have these rollbacks of the predecessor's policies. So I'm thinking, of course, about Secretary DeVos rolling back Obama-era protections for higher education borrowers and consumer protections related to for-profit colleges, for example. Are we having now a roll forward to Obama levels, or is there something else completely happening?
We're seeing a revisiting of some of those Obama-level policies, and in particular, the one that's going to be closely watched is the gainful employment rule that the Biden administration is going to negotiate again. That was a very controversial rule enacted under the Obama administration where career colleges, which are mostly for-profit, would include some two-year public colleges, but largely the for-profit sector, would have to show that their students were making enough money essentially to repay their loans. And there's a very complex formula that goes into that. And so the Biden administration is going to put that back in place or do their best to put that back in place. I don't doubt that there will be some legal challenge to this once it's passed. But the Biden administration, the folks who are there now, were around for the Obama administration, and maybe they've learned from their mistakes the first time around so that they can smooth their way to a rule that doesn't encounter a sort of longstanding legal challenge. That's the big one. The other big thing that people are going to be looking at are a revisiting of the Title IX rules. These were, of course, incredibly controversial under the so-called Dear Colleague letter of President Obama. That was 2011. The DeVos department rewrote the rules in essence to make it a little harder for people to file complaints. It narrowed the scope of activities that would be considered as sexual misconduct. And also it limited complaints to, for instance, the campus, not off campus. Those are big changes. And then some things about cross-examination of accusers, which is highly controversial, of course. The Biden administration is going to revisit that. They don't have to go through the negotiated rulemaking process for that like they are gainful employment and some of these other things. So the last news I've seen out of this was that we'll see something from the administration in the spring, April-ish.
We're talking with reporters Eric Kelderman and Andrew Ujifusa about Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona's first year in office. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And while you're scrolling on your phone, take a moment and follow me on Twitter at EWAEmily. Andrew, we were just talking with Eric about Title IX, and I think a lot of people do think about that as a higher education policy, but certainly it applies to K-12 as well. And Secretary Cardona had some remarks to make about that at his recent press conference. Can you give us the top line?
Basically, Title IX as it relates to K-12 education, last year, the Biden administration said that, in addition to revisiting Title IX rule, as Eric was talking about just now, they sort of said the Title IX rule from the Trump administration is still in effect, but we consider that in practical terms to be the floor in terms of how responsive school leaders need to be when dealing with, in particular when it comes to K-12, responding to reports of sexual misconduct, sexual assault. They're saying, for example, that schools should be relatively aggressive in terms of a response that they have to provide if there's a report, and that they shouldn't just assume that something isn't true if they hear a report of sexual misconduct. So I think they want schools, as I said, to be proactive in terms of Title IX and how it affects K-12. And I think that you're going to see that addressed in some way in the revision process, which, as Eric mentioned, is getting started this spring. The other thing I should say about Title IX and how the Biden administration is going to deal with the issue is in terms of protection of rights when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity. Last year, the Biden administration said that based on a Supreme Court ruling, they interpret that to mean that Title IX does cover rights when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity. I think that has obvious implications for schools when it comes to things like facilities access and athletics. So that's a big issue to be watching out for as well, and it's obviously going to be very controversial.
We mentioned hitting the pause on student loan debt repayments, but there's something else that President Biden did on his first day in the White House, and that was to sign an executive order extending protections to undocumented young people who were brought to the United States as children. Where do things stand right now, Eric, for DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals?
That's actually a great question. And when you posited that to me in an email, I actually had to go look it up because it's been sort of under the radar. So the latest information on that is there is still DACA for people that have already applied for and been approved for that program. A federal court ruling in July has barred any new applicants to that program. So that's where it's at. And the Department of Homeland Security, I guess in September, published a notice of proposed rulemaking. And so the Biden administration is going to continue in this, supporting this and making sure that those persons, if they're here and not yet in the program, that those persons will not be a priority for removal going forward.
And Andrew, DACA also has implications for the K-12 realm because we know there are tens of thousands of individuals who are here legally under this protection who are working in public schools.
That's right. This has been a long-running issue in the education community, sort of cutting across different groups and different people. Last April, I believe, Cardona sort of held a roundtable with undocumented educators who are protected by DACA. This obviously has downstream effects for their students and their experiences in schools. So as I said, this is a long-running issue, and I think a lot of people in the K-12 world want these educators protected. They don't want to lose them from their schools for understandable reasons. And so, yeah, this is a big issue for K-12 as well, and it's worth watching.
Eric, I'm curious, if you polled folks in the higher ed sphere and asked them to give Cardona a grade on his performance in this first year, what would his GPA be?
I'll be honest with you, I don't think a lot of folks in higher ed are paying much attention to the education secretary or even the department at this point. I think a lot of that has to do with what's happening nationally, with enrollment declines, with managing campus health and safety in the midst of an ongoing pandemic, the leadership challenges. I think in a way that's good for Cardona, right? That you're not sort of in the headlines the way sort of, say, a Betsy DeVos was all the time with sort of ill-considered or uninformed remarks or controversial sort of statements. I think that's good for him. On the other hand, I think, like I said before, I think the priority has just been so much on responding to the crisis in K-12 that the department just really has not prioritized higher ed to the extent that either the Obama or the DeVos departments did.
Do you have any sense that that's going to change in the coming months as it looks like the Omicron variant is stabilizing a bit?
I think the Title IX issue, because it's traditionally seen as a higher ed issue, that's going to attract a ton of attention. And the way that's handled, I think, is going to be under a lot of scrutiny from across numerous, not only sectors in higher education, but certainly Congress is going to be looking at that issue and all the higher ed associations as well. So I think that's going to be the marquee event in the next few months.
Clearly, very different from Betsy DeVos. She was polarizing. She was confirmed by the narrowest of margins. VP Mike Pence had to break the tie in the Senate at 50-50.
Yeah.
Cardona was confirmed 64-33. Do you have a sense that he's building some bridges across the aisle?
No, I don't. I think everything's super polarized right now. And I think as mild-mannered and well-spoken as he is, I get emails from the the various constituencies in Congress that represent Republicans, and they have not let up their criticism. Mostly, though, I think it's aimed at Biden policy per se and not the secretary. I think that's maybe the difference. Betsy DeVos made an easy target in a lot of ways for a number of people. I think Cardon is a tougher target for political opponents, but he sort of falls under the, if it's anything Biden's doing, we're against it sort of rhetoric that we hear occasionally.
Andrew, we heard from Connecticut reporters who covered Secretary Cardona when he was the state's education commissioner and also a local superintendent there. And they described him as someone who was relatively available, friendly with the press, could tell a joke, could relax. Did you get a sense of that at all for him right now, even amid this crisis? Is he enjoying the job?
I'm reluctant to speak to his sort of personal feelings. This is a very difficult job, and I suspect anybody would find it very stressful no matter what kind of public face they put on it. In interviews I've done with him, he's been relatively relaxed, dare I say chill. Maybe that's not the right word. But he has not seemed especially tense or stressed. But Eric alluded to the idea that he hasn't really built bridges with GOP lawmakers on the Hill, and reverse is probably true as well. I've seen him get visibly irritated in a few instances in public settings with him. Not so much his confirmation hearing when, he had to be a little bit more careful, but in subsequent hearings, I think he's shown a little bit of a lack of patience with questions about critical race theory, for example. I mentioned that earlier. So he's been relatively accessible. I certainly haven't gotten every interview that I've wanted with him when I would have liked one. That's not a shock. But I don't think there's any sort of sense that he's frazzled or ready to quit. I haven't heard anything along those lines, certainly.
Eric, do you want to weigh in there?
Well, I will say this administration is certainly far more accessible. I've done an interview with Undersecretary Quall. The press office is responsive to requests. Although I will say this, that the press office under DeVos was, I thought, believe it or not, relatively responsive to things given the sort of isolation or lack of access most people had to the secretary and other officials. But I think they've done a good job in being accessible overall.
I would second Eric's comments, and I do agree in particular that the DeVos folks are more accessible than some people might have assumed. I do think sometimes there was a sort of a defensive crouch when it came to DeVos's Ed department in the media, but that, to some people, that's a chicken and egg thing, right? It's like, were they defensive because, they didn't want to make her accessible, or were they afraid that the media or most of the media was giving her a raw deal, so they didn't want to expose her to that sort of unfair treatment? It depends on your perspective. But yeah, I found this department to be pretty accessible and responsive overall.
We've got a lot of listeners out there right now who are education reporters covering local, regional, state-level beats, but they are paying attention to what's happening in federal education policy. Quickly, I'd like to ask each of you to just share a story idea, something you'd like to see local reporters covering. Eric, we'll start with you.
I'll say this, which does not promote your cause here, but federal education policy is not the most important topic in higher ed right now. We are light years away from a higher ed reauthorization, frankly. It's not going to happen this year. That's no surprise. It's not going to happen next year because even if Republicans take over the Senate, they're not going to have a 60-vote margin, although I guess they could do away with the filibuster and then pass whatever they want. But it's just not a big priority in Congress. There are higher ed policies that are, I think, important, but federal policy is not it. I would say the biggest stories in higher ed right now are finances, enrollment declines, and I think something that we've covered, but I haven't necessarily seen a lot of this local coverage, but stresses on faculty and campus leadership, I think, are maybe the biggest story in higher ed right now, which is burnout for faculty and then the turnover in the leadership as a result of really the growing demands of the job.
That's fantastic advice, Eric. And as always, I appreciate your candor. Andrew, I'll open up the door a little wider for you, too. If there's a story on any front that you'd like to see more reporters covering on the education beat, now's your chance.
This is not a federal policy story, but one issue I'm curious about is we've seen a lot of sort of stories and debates and concerns about student misbehavior in a variety of forms, from relatively benign to very serious sort of misconduct. And it ties into concerns about the pandemic and how that's impacted students. We don't really have great data from the pandemic era, which we are still in, about this phenomenon or supposed phenomenon. I would love to see stories. I'd be really interested in stories that examine this issue at the local level. Are education leaders in the district seeing that? What data do they have to back it up? What are students saying about that? Do teachers have less patience than they used to, and so they're sort of quicker to report or respond to what they perceive as student misbehavior and misconduct? I think this gets at so many issues that are both hard issues and soft issues, so to speak. I would just be really interested to see more stories about that with as good a data, the best data we have right now, which may not be great, but I just think it opens up the chance to hear a lot of different voices and perspectives.
Andrew Ujifusa is an assistant editor at Education Week who covers Congress, the U.S. Department of Education, and national education policy and politics. Andrew, thank you very much for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much, Emily.
And Eric Kelderman has been a reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education since 2008. He covers a wide range of subjects, including money and accountability in higher education, state policy, accreditation, and legal affairs. And he's been known to sport a pretty dapper bow tie. Eric, always glad to have you here.
Always a pleasure to talk with you. I appreciate it.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there is a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.